Operatic voice types a classification system built 4 centuries ago that still decides who gets cast in every opera house on earth. The soprano, tenor, bass, and their related categories developed in Italy from the late 1500s onward, as opera composers needed a reliable way to write specific vocal parts for specific kinds of voices. By the early 1600s, composers like Monteverdi were writing roles that assumed a singer's voice fell into one of several established categories based on range and timbre. A trained opera singer's voice type is determined primarily by vocal range and timbre, not by gender alone. There are female voices classified as contralto that sit in a range lower than some tenors, and male voices classified as countertenor that sing higher than many sopranos. The categories describe the instrument, not the person. Did you know the classification system has almost nothing to do with whether the singer is a man or a woman? The main categories run from lowest to highest: bass, baritone, and tenor for male voices, and contralto, mezzo-soprano, and soprano for female voices, with countertenor as a male voice trained to sing in the alto or soprano range. Each category is defined by a typical range of roughly 2 octaves, though individual singers' actual ranges vary. Training focuses on resonance, breath control, and the specific repertoire suited to each category. This classification system underlies almost the entire history of Western opera and much of classical vocal music more broadly. Composers from Mozart to Verdi to Puccini wrote roles with specific voice types in mind, which is why certain operatic characters are almost always assigned to the same category of singer across centuries of performance. Vibrato, a slight, controlled wobble in pitch, and without it, the human voice sounds noticeably less alive. Vibrato has been documented in vocal performance for centuries, appearing in treatises on singing technique as early as the Renaissance, though its use and intensity have varied enormously across musical eras and cultures. Classical singing has generally embraced continuous vibrato since at least the 19th century, while folk and early music traditions often favor a straighter, vibrato-free tone. Vibrato is technically a regular, controlled oscillation in pitch, usually occurring between 4 and 7 times per second, produced by rhythmic movement in the larynx rather than the breath itself. Most listeners can't consciously detect that oscillation as a pitch change at all. They just perceive it as warmth or richness in the tone. Have you ever noticed that a voice without any vibrato sounds almost mechanical by comparison? Vibrato is created through small, regular contractions of the muscles surrounding the larynx, producing a periodic variation in pitch around a central note. Singers train to control both the speed and width of this oscillation. Excessive or uncontrolled vibrato is generally considered a technical flaw, while a complete absence of it in classical contexts can read as underdeveloped technique. Classical and operatic singing relies on vibrato as a core element of tone production across nearly all repertoire. Pop and folk singers use it more selectively, often switching between a straight tone and vibrato within the same phrase for expressive effect. Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey both used wide, controlled vibrato as a signature element of their vocal identity. Melisma, singing a single syllable across many different notes, and it's one of the oldest vocal techniques still shaping how pop singers sound today. Melisma appears in some of the earliest known vocal music traditions, including ancient Jewish cantorial singing and early Christian Gregorian chant, where a single syllable of text could be stretched across a long, winding melodic phrase. The technique survived through centuries of religious music and found a second major home in the Black American gospel tradition, which carried it directly into soul, R&B, and eventually mainstream pop. A single word in a gospel or R&B vocal run can be stretched across 10, 15, or even more individual notes, all sung on one syllable, requiring exceptional breath control and pitch accuracy to execute cleanly. Mariah Carey's recordings in the 1990s popularized this technique so widely in mainstream pop that an entire generation of singers adopted it as a default style. Can you think of a single technique that traveled further from ancient chant to modern pop radio? Melisma requires sustained breath support and precise control over rapid pitch changes within a single vowel sound, without re-articulating the consonant or syllable. Singers train scales and runs specifically to build the agility needed to execute melismatic passages cleanly rather than sliding imprecisely between notes. Gospel music relies on melisma as a central expressive device, often used to extend emotional climax within a phrase. R&B and soul absorbed it directly from gospel through artists who grew up singing in church. Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and later artists across pop and R&B built signature vocal runs around this technique, often imitated but rarely matched in precision. Falsetto, a register that lets male voices sing well above their normal range, by deliberately not using the full voice at all. Falsetto singing has been used in vocal music for centuries, with documented use in European sacred music as early as the medieval period, when it allowed male singers to perform parts written in a higher register, before the modern soprano voice category became standardized in secular contexts. It later became central to specific folk and popular traditions, including American doo-wop and soul music in the mid-20th century. In falsetto, the vocal folds vibrate without fully closing, which produces a lighter, more breathy tone than a singer's full chest voice, and allows access to a higher range than their normal voice would otherwise reach. Many listeners assume falsetto is simply singing high, but the mechanism is fundamentally different from a high note sung in full voice. Have you ever noticed the distinct shift in tone quality when a singer moves into falsetto mid-song? Falsetto occurs when the vocal folds vibrate only along their edges rather than their full length, reducing the mass involved in each vibration and naturally producing a higher, lighter sound with less power than full voice. This technique requires its own specific training to control reliably, since the transition between full voice and falsetto, known as the vocal break, can be difficult to manage smoothly. Falsetto became a defining vocal color in soul and doo-wop through singers like Frankie Valli and Smokey Robinson, and later in pop and R&B through Prince and Justin Timberlake, who used it as a primary expressive register rather than an occasional effect. Bee Gees built much of their disco-era sound around falsetto as the dominant lead vocal texture. Singing loudly in a high range while staying in full chest voice, the sound that defines musical theater and most modern pop choruses. Belting developed primarily within American musical theater in the early 20th century, as performers needed vocal power that could project over a full pit orchestra without electronic amplification, which was not yet standard in theaters. The technique later became central to pop, gospel, and rock vocal styles throughout the 20th century, as those genres also demanded loud, sustained, high notes. Belting uses the same vocal mechanism as normal chest voice speech, just pushed to a much higher pitch and greater volume, which is precisely why it can cause vocal strain or damage if done with poor technique. Unlike falsetto, which deliberately reduces vocal power to reach high notes safely, belting tries to keep full power at a range the voice wasn't naturally built to sustain. Why do you think so many famous belters have suffered vocal cord damage over long careers? Belting requires strong breath support and careful management of vocal fold tension to sustain a chest voice quality at a pitch range that would otherwise force a singer into a different register. Poor technique under these demands is a leading cause of vocal nodules and other injuries among professional singers, which is why vocal coaches treat belting as one of the most technically risky styles to teach. Belting defines the climactic moments of musical theatre, from classic Broadway scores to contemporary hits like Defying Gravity. Pop and rock singers, including Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, and Adele, built their most recognizable vocal moments around sustained belted notes at the emotional peak of a song. Whistle register. The highest vocal register a human voice can produce, and only a small number of singers can access it reliably. The whistle register has likely existed in human vocal capability throughout history, but it remained largely undocumented in Western popular music until the late 20th century, when singers began deliberately incorporating it as a performance technique, rather than treating it as an incidental vocal extreme. Minnie Riperton brought it to mainstream pop attention in the 1970s. The whistle register sits above the normal soprano range and is produced through a completely different vocal fold configuration than either chest voice or falsetto, which is why most singers, regardless of training, simply cannot access it, no matter how much they practice. It isn't purely a matter of skill. There appears to be a physiological component that not every voice has. Does that change how you think about vocal training and its actual limits? In the whistle register, only a small portion of the vocal folds vibrates, creating extremely high-frequency sounds that resemble a literal whistle more than a sung note. This register requires precise control of an extremely narrow vocal fold closure and very specific breath pressure, making it both physically demanding and difficult to sustain for long phrases. Mariah Carey became the artist most associated with the whistle register in mainstream pop, using it as a signature element in songs like Emotions. Ariana Grande and a small number of other contemporary pop vocalists have built parts of their vocal identity around reliable access to this register. Vocal techniques that sound like screaming, because in a very specific technical sense, they are, and trained singers can do it for hours without damaging their voice. Growling and screaming as a primary vocal technique emerged within heavy metal and hardcore punk, starting in the 1980s, as vocalists sought sounds aggressive enough to match the intensity of the music's distorted guitars and double bass drumming. Death metal and black metal each developed distinct variations, generally known as death growls and black metal shrieks. Properly trained growling and screaming techniques redirect vocal strain away from the delicate vocal folds and towards surrounding muscle structures, which is why professional metal vocalists can perform aggressive vocals for an entire set without the vocal damage an untrained scream would cause almost immediately. The sound is genuinely extreme, but the technique behind it is built specifically to avoid injury. Would you have guessed that a death growl requires more vocal control than a clean melodic line? These techniques typically involve false vocal fold vibration, where structures above the true vocal folds vibrate instead of or alongside them, along with controlled airflow and specific throat positioning to produce a distorted, harsh tone. Singers train this deliberately, often working with vocal coaches who specialize specifically in extreme vocal techniques, rather than traditional singing instruction. Death metal, black metal, hardcore, and metalcore all rely on growling and screaming as a primary vocal delivery rather than an occasional effect. Chuck Schuldiner of Death and George Corpse Grinder Fisher of Cannibal Corpse are widely cited as foundational figures in developing and refining death growl